Calvin Henshaw still bought tomatoes from her every Saturday. That detail matters. The man who had sat behind the county assessor's desk in Pikeville, Tennessee in the spring of 1937 and told a 16-year-old girl that she was making the worst decision of her short life. That man drove 4 miles to her roadside stand every single week for 15 years and paid full price without a word of irony. In the summer of 1953, a stranger standing beside him at the stand noticed the way Henshaw handled the tomatoes, turning them slowly in his hands, before placing them in his basket, and asked if he knew the woman who grew them. Henshaw set down the tomato he was holding. He looked at Flora Mae Gant across the stand, watched her weigh a basket for a young mother with 2 small children, pulling at her dress, watched her tear off the paper receipt with the practiced motion of someone who had done this 10,000 times. "I sold her the land that she grows these on," Henshaw said. Dollar bill, 1937. "I told her it was the worst piece of ground in Bledsoe County and the water on it would kill her livestock." The stranger waited. "Do you regret it?" he asked. Henshaw picked the tomato back up, turned it once more. "I regret that I didn't buy it before she walked in." Now go back to 1937. Go back to before any of that was possible, before anyone in Grassy Cove would have believed it. Go back to a girl with $1.12 in a tin can with holes punched in the bottom, walking into an office that smelled of old paper and pipe tobacco, carrying everything she owned in a flour sack that wasn't quite full. That is where this story begins. Flora Mae Gant had been at the Cumberland Mountain Home for Girls in Crossville, Tennessee, since she was 9 years old. Her mother had died of influenza in the winter of 1930, which the doctors called a medical event, and which the mountain people called what it was, a cold that got into the chest of a woman who was already worn down to almost nothing. Her father had died the year before that, crushed by a falling poplar on a timber crew in the gorge below their hollow. He had been 31 years old and had never once in his life owned the land he worked. There were no relatives who came forward. There was no money. There was no option that anyone offered Flora except the one that took her away from the only place she had ever known and put her behind a brick wall in Crossville with 43 other girls who had also run out of other options. 7 years at Cumberland, 7 years of cooking and sewing and scrubbing floors on her knees until the skin cracked and bled in the cold months. 7 years of keeping her head down in the ways that mattered and raising it in the one way that kept her alive inside. The garden. Cumberland Home had a kitchen garden behind the main building, a quarter-acre plot that supplied some of the home's vegetables from late spring through early fall. Most of the girls rotated through garden duty and hated every hour of it. Flora asked to be assigned there permanently when she was 10 years old. The woman who ran the garden looked at this small, serious child and said yes before she had finished thinking it through. Her name was Ida Hooper. Mrs. Hooper was 58 years old when Flora came to Cumberland, a widow since 1922, who had once taught natural science at a public school in Cookeville before the district decided it did not need female science teachers during a depression and let her go along with 4 others. She had come to Cumberland because they needed someone to manage the garden and she needed work, and the two facts aligned without any deeper meaning than that. She was not a warm woman in the way that word usually means. She did not hug her students or speak to them in the softened voice of someone performing kindness. She was exacting and impatient with imprecision, and she had no tolerance whatsoever for people who repeated mistakes they had already been shown how to avoid. Flora loved her completely and without reservation from the first week. What Mrs. Hooper had, and what Flora recognized without being able to name it, was a quality of attention. When Mrs. Hooper looked at a plant or a patch of soil or a row of seedlings, she looked the way a doctor looks at a patient, gathering information from every detail, simultaneously building a picture that was always more complete than the one available to anyone who was just glancing. She had been doing this for 30 years, and it had made her extraordinarily good at understanding what was happening below the surface of things. She passed this quality to Flora not through instruction, but through habit. She simply expected Flora to look that carefully, and Flora, who had never been expected to do anything carefully except sweep floors and iron collars, found that she was capable of it. The lesson that mattered most came on an ordinary afternoon in the summer of 1933. Flora was 12 years old. The two of them were walking the rows after a long rain checking for standing water when Flora stopped in front of the bean section and said, "Why is this row bigger than that one? We water them the same." Mrs. Hooper stopped walking. She turned and looked at Flora with an expression that was not quite a smile, but was something adjacent to satisfaction. The look of a person who has been waiting a long time for a particular question and has finally heard it. "Follow me," she said. They spent 2 hours that afternoon on their knees in the bean rows. Mrs. Hooper dug carefully with a trowel and showed Flora what was happening in the soil. The difference in color and texture between the two sections, the presence of certain small organisms in one and their absence in the other, the way the roots of the larger plants had branched and spread into territory that the smaller ones had not yet reached. She talked about the invisible world beneath the surface, the bacteria and fungi and earthworms and 100 other creatures that Flora could barely see, but whose work was written in every leaf and stem above them. "Dirt is not dirt," Mrs. Hooper said, not looking up from the trowel. "It is a living system. Everything that happens above the ground is a result of what is happening below it. Feed the system correctly and it will feed you. Starve it and it starves you back. You cannot cheat it and you cannot fool it. You can only learn it." She took out a small brown leather notebook from her coat pocket, the binding worn at the corners, the pages dense with close handwriting. She opened it to a page near the middle and read a passage aloud, something she had written years before about the relationship between root health and water quality. Then she closed it and put it away. "Everything I know worth knowing is in that book," she said. "Most of it I learned by making mistakes in front of plants that were patient enough to show me what I did wrong." Flora did not ask to see the notebook. She understood somehow that it was not something you asked to see. It was something that would be given or not given in its own time. In 1935, a new matron came to Cumberland. Her name was Dorothy Pruitt, and she was 45 years old, and she had run charitable institutions before, and she believed with the quiet certainty of someone who has never seriously questioned their own premises that the purpose of a home like Cumberland was to produce girls who could serve, not think, not question, not understand the nitrogen cycle or the relationship between soil pH and plant uptake. Serve. Cook and clean and sew and keep their eyes down and be grateful. She and Mrs. Hooper did not like each other. They were too professional to make this obvious in the ordinary run of things, but it surfaced in small ways. The gentle reductions in garden time that Pruitt began instituting in Flora's second year under her supervision, the additional sewing hours added to the schedule, the pointed comments about girls who spent more time with their hands in dirt than at the mending table. Flora adapted. She began rising before 5 in the morning in the gray dark before the home's routine began to spend time in the garden. She moved quietly and returned before breakfast and said nothing. For 3 months, no one noticed or cared. Then one morning in October 1935, Pruitt looked across the breakfast table at Flora's hands as the girls filed in and sat down. She saw the dark line under the fingernails, the particular staining of someone who has recently been working soil. "Have you been in the garden this morning?" Pruitt asked. The room went quiet in the way that rooms go quiet when authority asserts itself. "Yes, ma'am," Flora said. "After I said the morning hours were for other duties. You said the scheduled garden hours were changed. The morning before breakfast is not a scheduled hour." Pruitt looked at this 15-year-old girl for a long moment. The silence in the room had a texture to it. Then Pruitt picked up her brush and wrote something in the small notebook she kept in her breast pocket. "Note in file," she said quietly. "Uncooperative attitude." Flora did not respond. She picked up her fork and ate her breakfast. But the note went into the file and the file would follow her, and when the time came, it would be used the way such things are always used as evidence for a decision that had already been made on other grounds. Mrs. Hooper died in December of 1936. She did not die dramatically. She was not ill for a long period. She was simply there, and then she was not the way certain solid things can disappear between one morning and the next. Flora woke one day, and Mrs. Hooper had not come to the garden at her usual time, which was 6:15 regardless of weather or season. Flora waited 10 minutes, which was already unusual enough to create a small, cold feeling in her chest. Then she walked to the building where the staff had their rooms, climbed the stairs, and knocked on the door at the end of the hall. No answer. She pushed the door open. Mrs. Hooper was lying in her bed with her eyes closed and her hands folded on her chest in the composed manner of someone who had arranged herself before sleep and not woken afterward. Her right hand, Flora saw, was resting on the brown leather notebook. Flora stood in the doorway for a time that she could not afterward measure. Then she walked into the room, moving carefully as though noise might damage something that was already broken, and she lifted the notebook from the still hand and put it inside her dress against her chest. She walked back downstairs, out through the kitchen, and into the garden. She stood among the winter beds for a while. Then she went back inside and told the cook that Mrs. Hooper needed to be checked on. Nobody asked about the notebook. Flora did not believe anyone at Cumberland knew it existed. To them, Mrs. Hooper had been the garden woman, competent and somewhat difficult, now gone and needing to be replaced. What she had written in 30 years of careful observation was not something they would have thought to look for. Flora kept it under her mattress for the 3 months between Mrs. Hooper's death and her own departure from Cumberland. The departure, when it came in March of 1937, was not a surprise. Pruitt had been building toward it since she arrived, in the death of Mrs. Hooper, had removed the one person in the institution who had given Flora any kind of implicit protection simply by valuing her. Without that protection, the file with its accumulated notes about uncooperative attitudes and excessive time in the garden, and questions that disrupted the proper order of instruction, had nothing counterbalancing it. Pruitt called Flora into the office on a Wednesday morning and told her that the home needed to make space and that girls who were nearly 17 and had completed their practical education were expected to make their own way. Then she opened the desk drawer and took out a small envelope and set it on the desk. "Your savings," Pruitt said. 7 years of household work. The total that accumulated was $8.43. I have applied a standard adjustment for room board and educational services during your time here. The balance is $3.88. Flora looked at the envelope. Then she looked at Pruitt. "What regulation authorizes that adjustment?" Pruitt clasped her hands on the desk. "The adjustment is at the discretion of the administration." "Which regulation gives the administration that discretion?" "Miss Gant," Pruitt's voice was level, "I will need you to sign the receipt acknowledging that you have received the full amount owed." The receipt was already on the desk, pushed forward with 2 fingers. Flora looked at it. She understood with complete clarity what was happening. She had no lawyer. She had no advocate. She had no mechanism of appeal. She was 16 years old and entirely alone, and the woman across the desk from her had been running institutions like this one for 20 years and knew exactly how these conversations ended. "No," Flora said. Pruitt sat straighter. "I beg your pardon. I will not sign a document confirming that $3.88 is the full amount owed to me. It isn't." The silence that followed was different from the silence at the breakfast table 2 years before. That one had been the silence of an audience. This one was the silence of 2 people who understood that the conversation had arrived at its actual subject and that there was nothing left to negotiate. Pruitt kept the adjustment. Flora took the envelope with $3.88 and walked out of the office and did not look back at the desk or at the woman behind it. At the door of the building, she stopped and turned to look at the garden one last time. It was early March, nothing growing yet, the beds brown and bare under a gray sky. She knew every inch of it. She knew where the drainage was poor along the east wall and where the soil had gone compacted near the tool storage, and where the best earthworm activity was the dark, rich section in the far corner that Mrs. Hooper had spent 5 years building up from almost nothing. 7 years of her work was in that ground. She could not take any of it with her. She touched the notebook through the fabric of her dress. The tin can with the brandywine tomato seedling was in her flour sack. She had taken the seedling 3 days ago when she knew this morning was coming, pricking the roots loose carefully in the pre-dawn dark and settling them into the can with good soil from that far corner, the best soil on the property. She turned and walked away from Cumberland. By the time she reached Pikeville, she had spent $1.63 on food and one night of floor space in a church basement that offered charity lodging to travelers. She had $1.12 left when she pushed open the door of the county assessor's office and went inside. Calvin Henshaw was behind the counter, a tired-looking man of around 50, with the air of someone who had been dealing with other people's property problems for so long that he had lost the ability to be surprised by them. He looked up when Flora came in, took in the flour sack, the dress that was 2 inches too short, because she had grown over the winter and there had been no new dress, the general air of someone who had been walking for a long time. "Help you," he said. "I want to buy land," Flora said. "I have $1.12. Henshaw put down his pen. Whatever he had expected her to say, it was not that. He went to his filing cabinets and came back with a folder and spread several property listings on the counter. Most were priced far beyond what she had. He went through them quickly, eliminating each one with a brief explanation, and finally arrived at the last sheet in the folder. He set it on the counter separately. "There is one parcel assessed below your number," he said. 2 acres on the east side of Grassy Cove, assessed at 75 cents, no owner for 3 years. "What's wrong with it?" Flora asked immediately. Henshaw looked at her with a slight adjustment in his expression, the look of someone who has been underestimating a situation. "The water," he said. "There is a spring on the property. The water runs blue, not clear blue, not sky blue, a deep blue like something is wrong with it. People in the cove have been staying away from it for as long as anyone can remember." He paused. Then he opened the folder again and took out a separate sheet, a list of names and dates. He placed it on the counter in front of Flora. "This is the ownership history since 1891, he said. 9 owners. Average tenure just over 3 years. The longest anyone stayed was 6 years. The last man left after 4 months and sold the property back to the county for less than he paid." Flora looked at the list. She read each name, each date of purchase, each date of departure. Then she looked at the acreage description and the location note, and she said, "Who is Harold Vance?" Henshaw went still for just a moment. "Where did you see that name?" "He purchased 4 of these parcels after the original owners left, all 4 adjacent to the East Cove water table." Henshaw looked at her steadily. "Harold Vance owns about 400 acres in the West Cove. He has been trying to consolidate the eastern water rights for a decade. He believes control of the spring access will eventually matter for irrigation as the valley develops." He stopped. "He has made offers on the Blue Spring lot every time it has come available. The previous owners all sold to him eventually except 2. Why didn't he buy it when the last owner left?" "He made an offer. The county assessor at the time, my predecessor, declined to sell it privately and listed it for public sale instead." Henshaw paused. That decision was controversial. Flora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "If I buy this land, Vance will come to see me." "Within the week," Henshaw said. "He always does with new owners." Flora looked at the list one more time. Then she looked up at Henshaw. "What will happen if I don't sell to him?" Henshaw considered his answer carefully. In the past, when owners declined his initial offer, he was patient. He made life in the cove difficult in small ways. Disputes over road access, questions about property boundaries, that sort of thing. Eventually, most people found it easier to sell. He met her eyes. "You would be the 10th owner of that property, Miss Gant, Flora Gant. Miss Gant, you would be the 10th owner. You have $1.12. You appear to have no family in the area, and you would be starting alone on a piece of ground that has driven off 9 previous owners." He picked up the listing sheet. "I am not in the business of discouraging legal transactions, but I am telling you what I know." Flora reached into the flour sack and took out the small fold of bills and coins that was everything she had in the world. She counted out $1 and set it on the counter. "The assessment is 75 cents, she said. "I assume there is a recording fee." Henshaw looked at the dollar on the counter. He looked at Flora. Then he pulled the deed form from his drawer and began to write. The walk to Grassy Cove was 4 miles along a road that turned to dirt a mile out of Pikeville, and then to something barely worth calling a road at all as it approached the eastern edge of the valley. The cove itself was a strange geography, a large sinkhole basin ringed on all sides by mountains. The kind of place that felt enclosed without being uncomfortable about it, a natural bowl that held weather and sound differently than the open countryside. The geology was limestone karst porous and honeycombed with underground water movement, and the valley floor sat in it like something settled and ancient. Flora walked the last half mile on what was barely a path following the property description on her deed until the land changed beneath her feet. The soil went thinner, grayer, more resistant. The scrub grass grew lower and sparser. A few stunted cedar trees leaned into the prevailing wind at permanent angles shaped by years of argument with forces they could not overcome. Then she heard the water. It was not a dramatic sound. It was not the rushing of a stream or the falling of anything. It was a steady, low murmur, the sound of something that had been doing this for so long that it had gone beyond effort into simple persistence, water emerging from stone, because stone and water had made that arrangement long before there was anyone to observe it. She came around a limestone outcropping and stopped. The pool was perhaps 10 feet across, fed from a crack in the base of the bluff, its overflow running in a narrow channel across the flat ground until it disappeared into another fissure about 100 yards away. The car swallowing its own water back down the way, all the water in this valley eventually went underground. What stopped her was the color. It was blue in the way that certain things are blue when the word is barely adequate, not sky color, not watercolor, in any ordinary sense, but something deeper and more internal. A blue that seemed to come from within the water rather than from any reflection of the sky above it. In the direct afternoon light, it shifted toward turquoise at the edges and deepened toward indigo in the center where it was deepest. The stones on the bottom were coated in a fine pale sediment that caught the light and scattered it. The water was perfectly clear despite its color. She could see every stone, every irregularity of the bottom in complete detail. It was the most beautiful body of water she had ever seen. She stood at the edge for a long time. Then she reached into the flour sack and took out the brown leather notebook and opened it to the section Mrs. Hooper had written about evaluating natural water sources. She read the criteria slowly. Color as indicator of mineral content. Smell as indicator of organic contamination or sulfur. Clarity as indicator of particulate or biological load. The character of the surrounding rock as context for everything else. She leaned close to the surface and smelled the water. No sulfur, no copper, no rot, no organic heaviness. Stone cold and clean, and beneath that, something faintly sweet that she could not identify from anything in Mrs. Hooper's notes or from her own 7 years of experience. Not the sweetness of sugar or fruit, the sweetness of a mineral if minerals could be sweet, as though the rock itself had flavor. She sat back on her heels. She looked at the color. She looked at the surrounding limestone, the way the bluff rose clean and pale above the spring. She looked at the clarity of the water, the visibility of every stone on the bottom. Mrs. Hooper had written, when the surface evidence is contradictory, prioritize the evidence of your senses over the evidence of received opinion. Other people's fear is not data. Flora cupped her hands and brought the water to her mouth and drank. The cold was extraordinary. The kind of cold that registers as pain before it becomes pleasure, a temperature so far below expectation that the body reads it first as damage, and then when damage does not come as something close to grace. Her teeth ached with it. Her chest contracted around the temperature, and the taste was exactly what she had smelled, stone and mineral, and that faint, unnameable sweetness water that had traveled a long way through very old rock and arrived at the surface carrying whatever it had learned in the passage. She did not die. She did not feel sick. She sat by the blue pool in the late afternoon light and looked at the 2 acres of thin rocky soil and the stunted cedars and the limestone bluff and the spring flowing steady and cold from its crack in the rock. Then she opened the notebook to the first blank page she could find near the back where Mrs. Hooper's observations ended. She took the stub of pencil from her pocket and wrote in her careful, slightly irregular hand, Day 6, land 2 acres, money remaining 12 cents. One person wants my land. His name is Vance. Number of people supporting me, none. Tomato plant still alive. water blue and sweet, and I do not yet understand why. She looked at what she had written. Then she added one more line below it. Mrs. Hooper wrote that the right question is more valuable than a premature answer. So what is the right question for this water? The spring murmured in the growing dark. The color of the pool shifted as the light changed, moving through its range from turquoise toward indigo as the sun went behind the ridge. It did not look poisonous. It did not look cursed. It looked like something that had been waiting patient and indifferent to the opinions of the people who had been afraid of it for someone to arrive who was more interested in questions than in fear. Somewhere out in the cove, a half-mile west, Harold Vance was in his house. He knew because he always knew that the Blue Spring lot had changed hands again. He knew the new owner was a 16-year-old girl with no money and no family and no history in the valley. He had been watching that spring for 10 years. He had bought 8 of the 9 previous owners out one after another as each of them ran out of patience or money or will. He was not concerned. He was never concerned about the 10th owner of anything. There was always a price. There was always a point at which a person decided that what they were holding was not worth what it was costing them to hold it. He had never met anyone who had no other options. That distinction between a person with options choosing not to exercise them and a person for whom there was simply nowhere else to go was one he would spend the next several years learning to account for. But that education had not begun yet. The spring flowed in the dark blue and steady and cold the way it had been flowing since before there was a Bledsoe County or a state of Tennessee or a nation to contain either of them. The water had come down as rain decades before, seeped into the limestone, traveled through miles of rock, dissolved whatever the rock was willing to give it, and arrived at this surface crack to begin again. It had been doing this for a very long time. It had no opinion about Harold Vance or Dorothy Pruitt or Calvin Henshaw or the 9 people who had owned this ground and been frightened away by its color. It simply flowed, and beside it in a shelter made of a tarpaulin stretched between 2 cedar posts, a girl with 12 cents in a tin can and a dead woman's notebook and no other options made herself a fire from cedar branches and prepared to find out what question the water was asking. The tomato plant should not have been that tall. Flora knew this the way she knew everything that mattered, not from a book or from being told, but from 7 years of watching plants do what they were going to do, regardless of what anyone expected. She had grown Brandywine tomatoes at Cumberland, from seedlings to fruit twice, and she knew their pace, their incremental daily progress, the way they added height in mass in small, reliable amounts, the way a careful person saves money. A Brandywine in good soil, well-watered with adequate sun, grew at a pace you could measure week to week. This one was growing at a pace you could measure day to day. She had planted it 10 days ago in the thin rocky ground near the spring, in a hole she had dug down far enough to find something darker and more promising beneath the gray surface layer. And she had watered it twice a day from the pool, carrying it in the single tin cup she owned. In 10 days, the stem had gone from the thickness of a pencil to the thickness of her finger. The leaves had widened and darkened to a green so saturated it looked painted rather than grown. At the base of the stem, where stem met soil, she could see with the naked eye that something was happening underground, the soil mounding slightly where roots were pushing outward with a pressure that had physical consequence. She knelt beside it in the early morning of the 11th day and placed both hands flat on the ground around the plant and held them there. The soil was warm, not from the sun which had not yet cleared the eastern ridge, warm from below from activity, from the invisible machinery that Mrs. Hooper had spent years teaching her to understand. She could feel it the way you feel a conversation happening in the next room, not the words, but the fact of it, the undeniable presence of something working. She sat back and looked at the pool. The water flowed from its crack in the limestone with the same unhurried steadiness it always had. Whatever it was carrying up from the deep rock, whatever it had collected in its long passage through the mountain, it had been doing this for a very long time before Flora arrived, and it would continue doing it long after. She had simply been the first person to put a plant in its path. She needed to know if that was the whole answer. That afternoon, she planted 2 rows of everything. She had beans, corn squash, peppers, lettuce, cucumbers, the last of her seed stock. Half of each row she marked with small stakes. The staked half would get spring water. The other half would get rainwater from the barrel she had set up at the corner of her tarp shelter. Same soil, same sun, same everything, except the source of the water. She was not doing science in any formal sense. She did not have the vocabulary or the equipment for that. She was doing what Mrs. Hooper had always done, asking a question in the only language that produced reliable answers, which was the language of direct comparison. She wrote in the notebook that evening, "If the water is the variable, the plants will show it. Plants do not lie." What happened over the next 2 weeks was not subtle. The staked rows did not simply outperform the unstaked ones. They outperformed them in a way that made Flora stand at the end of the bed each evening and recount the measurements she had taken that morning because she kept suspecting she had written something down wrong. The spring-watered beans climbed their poles 3 days ahead of schedule. The corn on that side tasseled while the rain-watered corn was still building height. The tomato plants nearest the spring had stems she could no longer wrap her hand around. Mrs. Hooper had written in the notebook about the mineral content of limestone-filtered water, about the dissolved calcium and magnesium and phosphorus that certain aquifer systems carry to the surface, about how cultivated plants bred over centuries to respond to nutrition could, under the right conditions, express capabilities that ordinary growing environments never unlocked. Flora had read that section twice in her first week on the property. She had read it again now, standing between 2 rows of beans that should have been identical and were not, and she understood that she had not yet found the limit of what this water could do. She also understood, standing there in the August heat with sweat on her neck and good dirt under her fingernails, that the mineral explanation covered the mechanism but not the consequence. The consequence was larger than any explanation. The consequence was that 2 acres of land that 9 previous owners had abandoned as useless was producing food at a rate she was not prepared for. The winter that interrupted this understanding came early and hit hard. November turned cold before October had properly finished. By the first week of December, temperatures were dropping below freezing every night, and by mid-January of 1938, the thermometer outside Flora's tarp shelter was reading numbers she had not seen since Cumberland's worst winters. The shelter itself, which had served adequately through the fall, was not built for what was coming. She had no cabin. Owen Pate had not yet appeared in her life. She had the tarp, a fire she kept burning from dusk, until she could no longer keep her eyes open, and a wood supply that she had underestimated because she had never before been solely responsible for calculating what she needed to stay alive through a Tennessee winter. The cold that arrived in the 3rd week of January was the kind that does not negotiate. It came down from the ridge at night, and it settled into the valley, and it did not lift in the day the way cold usually does. Flora woke on the morning of January 19th to find the inside walls of her shelter rimed with frost and the spring running as a thin thread through ice that had sealed over most of the pool's surface. She got up and built the fire back and stood over it until she could feel her hands again. Then she went out to the garden. What she saw stopped her at the bed's edge. The kale and the winter spinach she had planted in September, still productive through November, had been hit by the freeze. Most of it was down, the leaves blackened and collapsed, the work of 4 months reduced in a single night to the texture of wet newspaper. She walked the rows slowly, her breath making clouds in the air, assessing what could be saved and what could not. The cold frame she had built from salvaged lumber over the most vulnerable seedlings had helped, but had not been enough. The glass pane she had used as a cover had cracked in the freeze. She stood at the end of the last row and did the calculation she had been avoiding. The food she had put up through the fall would carry her to mid-February if she was careful. After that, she would need to either buy supplies from the Crossroads store, which required money she did not have in sufficient quantity, or depend on what the cold frame seedlings could produce, which was now uncertain. For the first time since she had set up camp on this land, the question presented itself without softening. Had she miscalculated? The land was real. The water was real. What the water did to growing things was real. But none of that mattered in January when the crop was frozen and the shelter was inadequate, and she was 16 years old and entirely alone on the wrong end of a valley that did not know her name. She went back to the fire and opened the notebook to the page Mrs. Hooper had written about the difference between a plant that dies from cold and a plant that dies from lack of preparation for cold. The distinction was specific and practical. A plant that has been hardened through gradual exposure builds cellular resistance. A plant that has been kept warm until the freeze arrives has none. The cold does not kill the unprepared plant. The unpreparedness does. Flora read the passage twice. Then she closed the notebook and spent the rest of that day building a better cold frame from the lumber she had been saving for other purposes, sealing the joints with clay from the creek bank covering the seedlings, with every piece of insulating material she owned, including one of her 2 blankets. She was outside doing this work in the dark by firelight when she heard boots on the frozen ground. Nora Akers had walked half a mile in the January cold with a covered pot in both hands, and her eldest boy Clyde behind her carrying firewood. She set the pot down on Flora's makeshift table and looked at the partially built cold frame and at the blackened rows in the garden beds and at Flora standing in the firelight with clay on her hands and determination on her face. "You didn't send word," Nora said. "I didn't know to. When it gets like this, you send word." Nora picked up a piece of lumber and examined the joint Flora had been working on, then began fitting it herself with the efficiency of someone who had built things in the cold before. "My husband used to say the worst thing about a hard winter is that it teaches you what you should have done differently. The second worst thing is that it teaches you alone." They worked until midnight. When the cold frame was sealed and banked with straw and covered when the fire was rebuilt to last until morning. Nora Akers sat across from Flora and drank coffee from the pot she had brought and said, "You're going to make it through this winter, but next winter you'll have a proper structure and I'll show you how to put the garden to bed right in October." Flora looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" Nora wrapped both hands around her cup. "Because last August you gave me tomato seed without asking for anything back. And because my boy hasn't stopped talking about your garden since he saw it." She looked at Flora steadily. "And because this valley has needed someone like you on that piece of ground for a long time, and I'd rather help you stay than watch you leave." Clyde Akers came out of the tree line on the eastern edge of the property the following summer with a .22 rifle over one shoulder and stopped walking when he saw what was in front of him. He was 14 years old, a farm kid from the far side of the cove, with the angular, sunburned look of a boy who spent more time outside than in. He had passed this lot 100 times. He had never seen anything green on it. He stood at the fence line and stared. Flora was on her knees between the rows when she noticed him. She straightened and looked at the boy, looking at her garden. "The staked row or the unstaked row?" she said. He blinked. "What?" "You're looking at the difference between the 2 rows. Which side caught your eye first?" Clyde lowered the rifle slowly. He walked closer to the fence, close enough to see the distinction properly. The staked row on the left plants that were nearly twice the height of the other side stems thick leaves, broad and dark, the beans already reaching for their poles. The unstaked row on the right normal plants, healthy enough what you would expect from decent soil and regular water. "What did you do to the staked side?" he asked. "Nothing to the plants. Different water." He looked at the pool behind her. The blue pool, the one every child in Grassy Cove was told to avoid before they were old enough to ask why. "That water." "Yes." Clyde stood very still for a moment. Then he said with the directness of a 14-year-old who has not yet learned to soften observations, "My dad would have said you did something else. He wouldn't have believed it was just the water." "I know," Flora said. "Go get your mother anyway." Nora Akers already knew about the garden, had watched it develop through that second spring with a practical farmer's eye. But she let her son make the discovery himself, understanding that some knowledge has to be arrived at independently to be fully believed. When Clyde came home and described what he had seen and demanded she come look, she went with him without mentioning that she had already been there twice. She stood at the fence line and looked. Flora was still working, turning compost into a new bed on the far side of the garden. Nora watched for a full minute before Flora noticed her and straightened. They had reached an understanding over the winter that had the solidity of things built through shared difficulty. Nora did not ask what was in the water anymore. She had seen what it produced. She had signed her name to Flora's petition before Flora had finished asking. What she brought that second visit was simpler. Her son James, 16 years old, who could drive a nail straight in a covered dish of food, and the understanding that some work was better done by two people than one. Silas Ledbetter arrived the following week, having heard from the Crossroads store where information moved through Grassy Cove faster than water through limestone. He was 68 years old, and he walked with a deliberate heaviness, the walk of a man who had been putting weight on land his whole life and expected it to hold him. He had farmed the same 120 acres in the cove for 40 years. He walked the garden slowly with patience and without expression. He stopped at the Brandywine plant, now nearly 5 feet tall, with its first fruit set small green spheres beginning to swell on the lowest trusses. He looked at the stakes in the bean rows and at the clear difference between the two sides. Then he stood at the edge of the pool for a long time with his hands in his pockets. "My father died in 1895, he said. He was not looking at Flora. He was looking at the water. Bad summer. The rain quit in June and didn't come back. The wells went low. Everything he planted that year burned up in the ground." He paused. "He spent the last good money he had on seed for the following spring and died in November before he saw it go in. We ate bark and roots and whatever the Husk family could spare through that winter." He stopped. The spring murmured in the quiet. "That spring was flowing the whole time," he said, "right here, half a mile from our east fence line." He finally looked at Flora. "My grandfather told my father to stay away from it. My father told me. I told my boys." He shook his head slowly. 3 generations of Ledbetters walking around hungry on this end of the cove because the water was the wrong color. Flora did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would improve on what the silence was already doing. Silas reached up and pulled a half-ripe tomato from the lowest truss of the Brandywine plant. He bit into it without ceremony. The tomato was not quite at full sugar yet, still a few weeks from its peak, but what was there already was remarkable, a concentration and depth of flavor that had no equivalent in anything grown on ordinary ground with ordinary water. He chewed, swallowed, stood still. He did not cry. He was not a man who cried. But something happened in his face, a movement behind the eyes that was entirely private, the look of a man revising something that had been written a very long time ago. "Lord have mercy," he said quietly. Then, "That is the best tomato I have eaten in 68 years. He became her first public advocate, not from sentimentality, but from the same practical calculus that governed everything he did. He had seen something that worked, and he intended to tell people about it. Because in Grassy Cove, as in most places, what worked was news. By late July, 3 more families had walked the path to the eastern edge of the cove. By early August, Flora was selling produce at the Crossroads store, and the quality of it had become, in the particular way of small rural communities, a subject of conversation that grew in proportion to the number of people who had experienced it directly. Tobias Husk, who kept bees on the wooded ridge above the valley, and was 70 years old and had been keeping bees for 50 of those years, appeared at the property line on a Thursday afternoon and watched the activity around Flora's garden for a while before he spoke. "My bees are going to your flowers from a mile away," he said. "I've tracked them. They're leaving the ridge hives in the morning and coming straight here and not going anywhere else until they're full. 50 years I've watched bees work, and I've never seen them neglect every other source within range for a single garden." "What does that mean?" Flora asked. "It means whatever is in your flowers is something they want more than anything else available." He looked at the pool, "Which I suspect is what's in your water." He looked back at Flora. "I'd like to move 4 hives down here if you'll allow it." "You can move as many as you like," she said. He moved 4 that week. By the following spring, he would move 8 more. It was the honey from those hives, amber and thick, and with a complexity that people struggled to describe, that first traveled beyond Grassy Cove and began to make the Blue Spring property known in the wider county. But that was later. In the summer of 1938, what mattered was simpler and more immediate. The garden was working beyond any reasonable expectation, and Harold Vance had noticed. He noticed because Silas Ledbetter would not stop talking about the tomatoes. He noticed because the Crossroads store had begun stocking Blue Spring produce and had a waiting list for certain varieties. He noticed because three of his tenant farmers had come to him independently asking about the possibility of using Blue Spring water for their plots, which told him that the story had become specific enough to produce requests rather than just conversation. In May of 1938, Vance filed a petition with the Bledsoe County Council. His argument, delivered through a lawyer from Cookeville, who wore a suit that cost more than most men in the Cove earned in a month, was technical and measured and drew on actual provisions of Tennessee water law. A natural spring of significant flow occurring on private land could, under certain conditions involving demonstrated historical community access and public benefit, be subject to shared use provisions. The Blue Spring, Vance's lawyer argued, had been used or attempted to be used by multiple community members across decades. Its concentration on private land in the hands of a single recent purchaser with no prior claim to the Cove or its resources potentially conflicted with the broader public interest in water access. It was not a frivolous argument. That was the problem. A frivolous argument could be dismissed quickly. This one required an answer. The county council scheduled a formal hearing for June 12th. Flora received the notice on a Tuesday. She read it twice standing in the middle of her garden, then folded it carefully and put it in the notebook beside the page where she had written her first entry 11 months ago. Owen Pate had been working on the property since February, building the cabin she had needed before the last winter and had survived without. He was 24 years old, a carpenter from Crossville who had come to Grassy Cove originally on a job for the Husk family and had been pulled into Flora's orbit through Nora Akers, who had told him with characteristic directness that there was a girl on the east edge of the Cove who had built something remarkable and needed a proper structure before another winter came. He had shown up with his tools and looked at the site and asked 4 specific questions about what she wanted and then started building without further conversation. He was the kind of man who communicated primarily through the quality of his work, and his work was very good. The keel wall he was laying for the channel system, limestone blocks cut from the bluff above and fitted without mortar, was so precise that Flora had stopped and stared at it the first time she saw it in place. She brought the notice to him that Tuesday afternoon. He read it, then read it again, then set it on the stone wall beside him and picked up his chisel and tapped a block into alignment before he spoke. "He doesn't want to win at the council," Owen said. "How do you know that?" "Because if he wanted to win, he would have filed this 2 years ago before you had established anything. Before Silas Ledbetter was talking about you at every store in the county. Before you had 30 families using the water." He tapped another block. "He filed it now because now the hearing will be public, and public hearings cost money to respond to and take time and energy away from everything else you're doing." He looked at her. "My father used the same approach on a neighbor in 1921. He didn't need to win the case. He just needed the neighbor to decide the land wasn't worth the trouble." Flora looked at the notice in his hand. "Did the neighbor sell?" "Yes." And then Owen set down the chisel. "And then my father got the land, and the neighbor got something he didn't particularly want, and life went on." He paused. "My father wasn't wrong that it was effective. He was wrong about what effectiveness is worth." He handed the notice back. "What do you need to respond to this? Evidence of community benefit, documented use by multiple parties, statements from people who can speak to the public value of the water access." "Silas Ledbetter will fill a room with statements." "I know, but I need to ask them. I can't assume." She spent the next 3 weeks asking. Not everyone said yes immediately. Several families who had been using the water quietly and gratefully were not eager to put their names on a document that positioned them against Harold Vance, who owned land adjacent to many of their properties and whose goodwill had practical consequences. Flora did not argue with their hesitation. She understood it. She thanked them and moved on and let the weight of the argument make itself without her pushing it. Nora Akers was the first to sign. She signed on the same day Flora asked her without deliberation. "I know what that water did for my garden last year," she said. "If I won't say so in writing, I don't deserve to use it." Silas Ledbetter signed second and spent the following week personally visiting every family in the Eastern Cove with a copy of the petition and his own account of what the spring had produced. By June 8th, 4 days before the hearing, Flora had 31 signatures. The Bledsoe County Council chamber was a room that had been built for practical governance and had the aesthetics of that purpose: plain wood benches, a raised table for the 5 council members' windows that provided light without view. It was nearly full on the morning of June 12th, which was unusual. Most council business attracted no one. Vance's lawyer spoke first for 20 minutes in the measured cadences of a man who had done this many times in many rooms. He cited statutes. He described the historical pattern of community access to the spring. He argued that consolidating control of a significant natural water source in the hands of a recent single purchaser, regardless of her legal title, raised questions of equity and precedent that the council was obligated to examine. It was well done. Flora sat on the front bench and listened to the whole thing and did not take notes. Then Silas Ledbetter stood up. He had not prepared remarks in any formal sense. He had simply decided what he wanted to say, and he said it standing without notes in his good church coat, his voice carrying the particular authority of a man who has spent 68 years developing the right to an opinion about this specific valley. He told them about his father. Not in the compressed version he had shared with Flora at the pool's edge, but in the full weight of it: the specific winter, the specific hunger, the specific distance between the dry fields and the blue water that no one would touch. He described watching Flora's garden produce things that had no precedent in the cove. He described the families he knew personally who had used the water on their own plots and what had resulted. He described quietly and without flourish what it meant to a community that had farmed difficult ground for generations to discover that there was a resource within their reach that could change what that ground was capable of. Then he said, "The young woman who found this out and proved it and shared it with everyone who wanted it is sitting right there. She is 17 years old. She bought that land legal, and she has used it in the most public-spirited way I have ever seen anyone use anything in 40 years of living in this cove. If this council moves to restrict her rights on that property, you will be teaching every young person in Bledsoe County that initiative and generosity are liabilities." He sat down. The council deliberated for 22 minutes. Their ruling did not fully vindicate Flora, and it did not fully vindicate Vance. Flora retained full legal ownership and primary rights to the spring. However, she was required to file an official documentation of community use access within 90 days, formalizing what she had already been doing informally, and the filing would create a legal record that prevented any future owner from restricting that access. Vance's lawyer argued for something stronger. The council chairman told him the current ruling was the council's final position. Outside the chamber, the afternoon was bright, and the crowd from inside was dispersing around them. Owen stood beside Flora. Nora Akers was a few steps away talking to Silas. Flora had 31 signatures. She would have 40 before the deadline. She should have felt the day was complete. She did not. 3 days later, Harold Vance came to the property himself. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon alone, no lawyer behind him, no papers in his hand. Just a man in his working clothes walking up the path that led to the spring. Flora saw him coming and kept working until he reached the gate. Then she straightened and waited. He was 53 years old that summer, a solidly built man whose face showed the specific weathering of someone who had spent decades outdoors making decisions about land. He looked at the garden for a moment before he spoke, and something in the way he looked at it told Flora that he was seeing it properly for the first time, not as a transaction or a property dispute, but as the thing it actually was. $200, he said, for everything. The land, the spring, writes the deed. I'll have the paperwork drawn up this week. $200 in the summer of 1938 was a sum that could buy 15 acres of decent farmland in Bledsoe County. It was more money than most families Flora knew had seen in a single year. It was the kind of number that a person with 12 cents to her name when she arrived here 18 months ago should have had no ability to refuse. Flora stood at the gate and looked at Harold Vance and at the $200 he was holding in the form of a number between them. Then she looked past him out at the garden, at the channel system Owen had built from limestone cut by hand, at the spring enclosure taking shape against the bluff, at the 12 hive boxes along the eastern edge that Tobias Husk had brought down from the ridge one by one because his bees had decided this was where they needed to be. She thought about Silas Ledbetter's father dead in 1895 with the spring half a mile from his fence line. She thought about Nora Akers on the coldest night of January carrying a pot through the dark to a girl she barely knew. She thought about Clyde E. Akers organizing water delivery routes for families who couldn't make the walk. She thought about all of it, and she understood standing at the gate with $200 being offered to her that what was behind her was not hers to sell. No, she said. Vance looked at her for a long moment. He was not accustomed to this answer from people in her position. That's a considerable sum, he said. I know what it is. You understand I may still have avenues through the council. You heard what the council said. He stood there a moment longer, the way a man stands when he is revising an assessment he had considered settled. Then he nodded once a small, precise movement and turned and walked back down the path. Flora watched him go. She did not feel triumphant. She felt the weight of the decision the way you feel the weight of a structure you have just committed to maintaining, knowing it will require work for the rest of your life and that the work is worth it. She went back to the garden and filed her documentation 48 signatures strong and waited. That evening, sitting on the cabin steps with a notebook on her knee and the spring audible in the dark, she wrote, I have the paper, the spring is protected. Vance made his final offer and I said no. So why does none of this feel finished? She looked at the question, then wrote the answer below it, because Vance is still wrong about what the spring is worth. He thinks it is worth money. Stopping someone from being wrong is not the same as showing them what is right. That part is still ahead. She closed the notebook. In 3 days, a man named Elliot Crane would drive into Grassy Cove from Knoxville with testing equipment in the back seat and a letter of introduction from the county extension agent. And everything Flora thought she understood about the spring would be confirmed, deepened, and given a language she had not previously had. But that night, she simply sat with her question and let the spring answer it in the only way the spring knew how, which was by continuing to flow. The ribbon was blue, which seemed appropriate. It came home from the Tennessee State Fair in Nashville in the fall of 1946. Inside Tobias Husk's coat pocket pressed flat to protect it, and he carried it that way the 4 miles from the road to Flora's property because he said the only place he wanted to open it was beside the water that had made it possible. He was 80 years old. He had kept bees for 60 of those years. He had never won anything. Flora was on her knees in the far bed when he arrived, turning in compost along the bean rows, and she did not hear him until he was close enough to cast a shadow. She looked up. He held out the ribbon without ceremony. She took it, read the inscription, read the judge's notation on the card attached, complex floral character, unusual mineral finish, unlike any honey produced in this state. 60 years, Tobias said. I kept the same bees on the same ridge and made the same honey and entered the same fair 4 times and came home with nothing. He looked out at the hives arranged along the eastern edge of the garden, 12 of them now, white boxes in a row with the constant low traffic of bees moving in and out. 8 years on your land, and they learned to make something nobody had a word for. Flora stood up and pinned the ribbon to the post of the tool shed where she would see it every morning. Not for pride, or not only for that, for the specific reminder it carried that transformation was not always fast. Sometimes it took 8 years of bees learning a new garden. Sometimes it took longer than that. That same fall, a letter arrived from Knoxville. Dr. Elliot Crane had first come to Grassy Cove in the summer of 1939, sent by the University of Tennessee's Geology Department after the county extension agent's report about unusual agricultural productivity associated with a mineral spring reached the right desk. He had arrived skeptical and left 3 days later with 24 water samples, a soil core collection, and an expression that Flora had learned to recognize by then as the face of someone whose professional assumptions had just been seriously disrupted. She had not been present for the expression when it first appeared. She had been working. But Owen, who was finishing the channel system that week, had watched Crane stand at the pool's edge for a long time on the second day, longer than any purely technical examination required, and had told her about it that evening. He stopped taking notes, Owen said. He just stood there. What was he looking at? The water, just the water, like he was trying to decide something. Crane had published a paper in 1939 that attracted almost no attention, which was not surprising given that the world in 1939 had positioned itself to be interested in other things. But he had not forgotten what he found. He had come back twice in the early 1940s, each time spending a few days on the property, adding to his data, refining his analysis. And now, 7 years after his first visit, he was writing to say that he was bringing a full research team from the university's agriculture department, that they intended a systematic 5-year study of crop yields and nutritional density across 12 varieties under spring irrigation versus conventional methods, and that he wanted Flora's formal cooperation. She sat on the porch steps with the letter and read it twice. Then she called to Owen, who was inside repairing a window frame, and read it to him. He was quiet for a moment. What do you want to do? I want to say yes. Whatever he finds, it will be documented. It will be permanent. She folded the letter along its original creases. The spring will outlast me. The science should too. Owen came to the door and leaned against the frame. He had the particular stillness he carried when he was thinking through a structural problem, applying the same deliberate patience to whatever was in front of him. It'll also outlast Vance, he said. If his descendants ever decide to try again, they'll have 40 years of university data to argue against. Flora looked at him. That's a very practical way to think about science. I'm a practical person, he said, and went back to the window. Crane arrived in the spring of 1950 with 3 colleagues, a graduate student, and enough equipment to fill the back of a pickup truck. He was in his early 50s by then, grayer and slightly heavier than the man who had first stood at the pool's edge in 1939, but with the same quality of focused attention that had brought him back here 3 times. He set up his instruments with minimal conversation and got to work. On the 3rd evening, he sat on Flora's porch and spread his notes across his knees in the way she remembered from 11 years ago, papers covered in the dense abbreviations of a man who thought faster than he wrote. He looked up after a while and said, I want to ask you something that isn't in my research protocol. Ask it. When you drank that water the first day, before you had any data, before you had done any comparison, how did you decide it was safe? Flora looked at the darkening line of the ridge. I used the notebook. Mrs. Hooper's criteria for evaluating water sources. Yes, no sulfur, no organic smell, clear to the bottom. The character of the surrounding rock. Everything she had written about what contaminated water smelled and looked like was absent. She paused. And she had written something else. She wrote that other people's fear is not data. Crane wrote nothing down. He looked at his hands. I have spent 30 years in a university teaching people to observe carefully and reason from evidence. In 11 years of studying your spring, I have not found a single thing you got wrong by applying the method of a woman who never had a university position. He paused. That should be humbling to me. I think it probably is. Flora said nothing for a moment. Then she would have liked hearing that. Where is she buried? At Cumberland, in the staff section. No one visits. Crane was quiet. I would like to acknowledge her in the paper, by name, with a description of her methodology. She would have said that was unnecessary. I know. I'm going to do it anyway. The paper was published in 1955 in the Journal of Agricultural Science. It ran to 41 pages. The results showed yield increases of 40 to 200% and nutritional density improvements of 30 to 60% in spring-irrigated crops across all 12 varieties studied. The acknowledgement section on the final page read, the authors are indebted to Florigant Patey, who had the courage to plant where others feared to drink, and to Ida Hooper, who taught her to look. Flora read that page sitting at the kitchen table on a February morning with snow on the ground and the spring running its steady note outside. She read it once, set the journal down, and sat still for a while. Owen watched her from across the table without speaking. She taught me to look, Flora said finally. Yes, that's the whole thing. That's all of it. She picked up the journal again and looked at the line. If she had not taught me to look, I would have walked past that spring the way everyone else did. I would have been afraid of the color. She set it down again. One person, one woman in a kitchen garden at an orphanage in Crossville, Tennessee. That's the whole chain. Owen got up and poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her. Most chains go back to one person, he said. That's what makes them chains. Harold Vance came to the property in the summer of 1940, the year after the council hearing during a dry stretch that had lowered the water table across the western cove and caused 3 of his best fields to show stress. He came alone. No lawyer, no assistant, no document in hand. He walked from the road to the property line and stood there until Flora saw him and came over. He was 55 years old that summer, still a substantial presence. A man who had accumulated enough of everything to make his losses feel like choices rather than deprivations. But he stood at the fence line that morning without any of that insulation and said, I need water for the east 4 acres. My system is failing in this dry stretch. Flora looked at him for a moment. She thought about the 9 previous owners. She thought about the petition and the Cookville lawyer and the $200 and the deliberate strategy of making her too tired to hold on. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about something else, something Mrs. Hooper had said once about the difference between what people do and what they are. She went to the pool and filled a bucket and brought it back. Free, she said, same as everyone. Vance looked at the bucket of blue water. He was not a man who showed much, but something moved through his expression in that moment, a long-held position encountering something it had not budgeted for. You could have turned me away, he said. I could have. It wouldn't have helped your crops. He picked up the bucket. He stood with it for a moment longer than necessary. I spent 3 years trying to take this land from you, he said. I know. I was right about the value of the water. Yes, I was wrong about everything else. He carried the bucket back to his truck. He came back the following week with 2 empty barrels in the truck bed. He came back the week after that. By the end of that summer, it was simply a thing that happened. Vance's truck at the spring access point twice a week, the barrels going out full and coming back empty. No money exchanged, no conversation required. He never apologized directly. Flora did not need him to. The changed behavior was the apology expressed in the only language that 2 practical people fully trust, the language of what you actually do rather than what you say about it. He died in 1953 at the age of 67. His son told Flora at the funeral, standing beside the grave in the Grassy Cove Methodist churchyard, that in his last year, his father had said once that the Blue Spring land was the only transaction in his life he was glad he had lost. The war years tested everything. Between 1942 and 1945, the Cove operated under the same rationing and scarcity that operated everywhere in the country, and the marginal soil that characterized most of Grassy Cove's farmland proved under those conditions exactly as difficult as it had always been. Victory gardens in the valley yielded what thin rocky ground and ordinary water yielded, which was enough to matter but not enough to transform. Flora and Owen, who had married quietly in the spring of 1942, in the same county courthouse where the Blue Spring deed had been recorded 5 years earlier, opened the property completely. There was no formal announcement. Flora simply told Nora Akers, and Nora told everyone else with the efficiency she brought to all practical matters, and within a week there was a steady stream of families coming to the spring access point with jugs and barrels and whatever containers they had. Owen built a stone receiving basin beside the pool where 4 people could fill containers simultaneously, which reduced the weight and made the process less chaotic. He built a covered seating area beside it from leftover lumber, with a roof to keep the rain off and a bench along each wall, because he noticed that people who came to fill water often stayed to talk, and that the talking was part of something he did not have a precise name for, but recognized as necessary. Flora held classes on Saturday mornings. Not formal instruction, nothing that required anyone to sit still or take notes. She walked through the beds with whoever had come that week and talked about what she was doing and why, demonstrating the composting technique and the rotation schedule and the soil reading that Mrs. Hooper had spent years teaching her. She gave away seedlings started in spring water tomato and pepper plants that were already thick-stemmed and dark-leafed before they ever went into someone else's ground. In the summer of 1943, the Dry Summer Clyde Acres organized a water delivery system using the farm truck his family had managed to keep running and 2 donated barrels. He mapped the families who could not make the walk themselves, the elderly and the infirm, and the mothers with too many small children to manage the distance, and he made 2 trips a day during the worst of the dry stretch. He was 20 years old and had been exempted from the draft by a knee injury sustained the previous year, and he moved through this work with the focused energy of someone who had found the task that fit the specific shape of what he could do. Silas Ledbetter, 74 years old and moving slowly, sat at the stone basin from 7 in the morning until noon every weekday and kept a handwritten log of every family that came and how much they took. He said he could not lift the barrels anymore, but he could still count, and accurate records were how you demonstrated public benefit when someone later decided to question it. His records ran to 11 pages and formed the backbone of the documentation Flora had filed with the county. The council's requirement had turned out to be, in ways none of them anticipated at the time of the hearing, a form of protection. The formal record of community use created a legal foundation that no future challenge could easily dismantle. One family remained outside all of this. The Dorseys had come to Grassy Cove from Ohio in 1941, drawn by the lowland prices and the promise of something quieter than what they had left. Margaret Dorsey was a practical woman in most respects, but she had a specific and immovable conviction that the blue water was wrong in a way that defied examination. A conviction that had nothing to do with evidence because it predated any encounter with evidence. She had heard about it before she arrived. She had made up her mind before she saw it. During the dry summer of 1943, when her cistern went dry in the 3rd week, she did not come to the spring access point. She sent her husband, who came back with water and did not mention where it had come from, and she accepted this arrangement as long as the exact source remained unacknowledged between them. Flora knew. Owen knew. Neither of them said anything about it to anyone. Then one morning, Flora walked to the Dorsey property with a sealed jar of the previous summer's Blue Spring honey and left it on the gate post without knocking. There was no note. There was no explanation required. The jar was simply there when Margaret Dorsey opened her door. 3 days later, the empty jar was on Flora's gate post. The exchange continued every few months for the next several years. 2 women who never discussed what the jars meant, passing them back and forth across a silence that was not unfriendly. At some point, the silence simply became a kind of communication, one that both of them understood, and neither of them needed to translate. Margaret Dorsey came to one of Flora's Saturday morning classes in 1947. She stood at the back and did not ask questions and left without speaking to Flora directly. She came back the following Saturday, and the one after that. They became, over the following decades, something that was not quite friendship and was more than neighborliness. It was the relationship of 2 people who had arrived at an understanding through patience rather than argument, which is a more durable kind of understanding than most. Iris Pate was 28 years old in the spring of 1972, the year after Owen died, and she had grown up on a property where abundance was the baseline and where the work of maintaining it was simply what the days were made of. She knew the spring intimately. She knew the garden in the way that people know things they have known since before they could explain them. She was competent and clear-eyed, and she had her father's quality of thinking carefully before speaking. She also read business journals, which her mother did not. She brought the subject up on a May evening when the 2 of them were sitting on the porch after supper, the spring audible in the warm dark, a cove settling into its night sounds around them. She had been preparing what she wanted to say for several weeks. "There is a bottling company in Knoxville," she said. They've been expanding into specialty mineral water. They contacted me last month. They want to discuss licensing rights for the spring. Flora was quiet. I didn't respond yet, Iris said. I wanted to talk to you first. But the number they mentioned was significant. How significant? Iris told her. Flora looked out at the dark yard, at the line of Owen's keel wall, visible in the moonlight at the stone basin he had built beside the pool at the bench where Silas Ledbetter had sat keeping his log for 3 years before his knees finally gave out entirely. If the water is sold by the bottle, she said, what happens to the families who have been coming here with their jugs? Iris had prepared for this question. The licensing arrangement would be for commercial production only. Individual access could be protected by covenant. Could be. Yes. Flora was quiet for a while. Iris waited. She had learned patience from her father, and she applied it now. Your great-grandmother, Flora said finally, is a woman named Ida Hooper. She is buried in the staff section of the Cumberland Mountain Home Cemetery in Crossville, and no one visits her grave. She spent 30 years learning everything worth knowing about soil and water and growing things, and she wrote it all down in a notebook, and she gave it to a 9-year-old girl because she believed that knowledge had no value unless it moved. She paused. She did not charge for it. She did not license it. She gave it because she understood that the value of a thing is not the same as its price. Iris said nothing. I did not create that spring, Flora continued. I did not create the limestone that filters the water, or the aquifer that feeds it, or the geology that has been doing this work for longer than there have been people to benefit from it. I happen to be the person who was desperate enough and curious enough to kneel beside it and drink. She looked at her daughter. You cannot sell what you did not make. The conversation ended there. Iris did not bring it up again. She wrote back to the bottling company and declined their inquiry. Flora began writing her will that fall. The process took several months because she wanted to be precise, and precision in legal matters required language she did not naturally use and had to work at. A lawyer in Cookville named Thomas Finch helped her with the drafting through the winter. The central provision was straightforward. The Blue Spring property and all water rights associated with it were to be held in perpetual community trust, administered by a cooperative board drawn from the families of Grassy Cove, with a single unalterable condition written into the covenant in language that Finch told her was unusually direct for a legal document. She told him to leave it exactly as she had written it. Water from this spring shall remain free to any person who needs it without condition, without payment, in perpetuity. When the Grassy Cove Blue Spring Agricultural Cooperative was formally established in 1980, with a pipe system that Flora's sons helped engineer to carry the mineral water to farms across the county, Clyde Akers was the one who drafted the organizational bylaws. He was 57 years old, the boy who had stood at the fence line in the summer of 1938 and stared at 2 rows of beans that shouldn't have been different and were. The first article of the bylaws was a direct quotation from Flora's will covenant, placed there by his own choice. He brought Flora the signed documents on a Thursday morning. She read the first article and handed the papers back. Correct, she said. That's all, he said. What else is there? He thought about it. I guess that is all, he said. The property was assessed in that same year at $47,000. Flora received the assessment notice in the mail, read the number, and used the envelope as a bookmark in Mrs. Hooper's notebook for the rest of her life. Owen Pate died in September of 1971 on the porch he had built in 1944 from wood he had cut himself from the ridge timber and cured for 2 years in the barn before touching it with a tool because he believed that materials used before they were ready never held properly. He was 58 years old. The cancer had been diagnosed in the spring and had moved faster than the doctor expected. He spent the summer finishing things. Not the dramatic, desperate finishing of a man trying to outrun time, but the considered completion of someone who believed that work left half done was a form of discourtesy to whoever came after. He repaired the channel section that had developed a hairline fracture in the coldest winter of 1968. He replaced 3 boards on the spring enclosure boards that had weathered to the point where they would need replacement within a year. He built the stone bench at the pool's edge that had been in his plans for 2 years and that he had simply not gotten to. On an evening in late August, he brought Flora to the pool and showed her what he had added to the granite stone. He had carved it himself, which was not his usual medium, and the letters were less precise than his carpentry, but they were permanent. Below the original inscription in smaller letters, Hooper taught her to look. She taught us to see. Flora stood in front of the stone for a long time. The spring moved past it, blue and cold, indifferent to the September heat. "How did you know her name?" she asked. "You say it in your sleep," he said. "You've said it since 1938. I looked it up in the Cumberland records in 1945 to make sure I had the spelling right." Flora turned to look at him. He was watching her with the particular quality of attention he had always brought to the things he cared about, steady and unhurried and fully present. "You looked her up 10 years ago," Flora said. "I wanted to have the spelling ready when the time came." She looked back at the stone. The evening light was doing something to the water, catching the mineral's suspension at an angle that made the blue shift and deepen. Behind them, the 12 hives stood along the eastern edge of the garden in their row. The channel system ran its quiet sound through the beds. The cabin sat solid and square on its foundation, the porch level after 27 years, the window frames true. "Owen," she said. "Yes, you built everything correctly." He was quiet for a moment. "That's all I wanted," he said. He died 3 weeks later in the chair on the porch on a cool September morning, with a glass of blue water on the table beside him and the sound of the spring in the background. Flora was beside him. She had been there all morning. She held his hand through the last of it and then sat with him for a while after listening to the spring run its note in the silence. She buried him at the base of the bluff near the stone where the sound of the water was constant and the ground was shaded through the hottest part of the day. It was the spot he had pointed to once years ago, walking the property line with a survey question in mind, and she had understood then what he meant, though neither of them said it. She was 50 years old. She gardened every day for the next 12 years with her hands in the same ground and the same water and the same seeds saved annually from the Brandywine line that traced back without interruption to the tin cans she had carried out of Cumberland in 1937. The plants that grew from those seeds were the direct descendants of the first plant she had watered with the Blue Spring generation by generation, the same variety shaped over 46 seasons by the specific mineral character of this specific water in this specific limestone valley. Tobias Husk died in 1965. His grandson took over the hives and kept them on the property because the agreement was by then simply a fact of the place, part of its permanent arrangement. The honey still took ribbons at the state fair most years. Silas Leadbetter died in 1960 at the age of 91, which startled everyone, including himself. At his funeral, his son read a passage from the journal Silas had kept for the 3 dry summers he had sat at the stone basin. The last entry, written on the day the rains finally came back, said only, "Basin closed for the season. Families served 247. Water given not measured. Some things should not be measured." On an April morning in 1983, Flora rose before dawn, as she always did, drank a glass of cold blue water standing at the kitchen window, and took the notebook from its place on the shelf beside the door. It was held together now with a length of leather cord that Iris had tied around it years ago when the original binding finally gave way entirely. The pages inside were dense with 2 sets of handwriting, Ida Hooper's careful scientific cursive filling the first 2/3 and Flora's own slightly irregular hand filling the rest with the last entry dated the previous week. She carried it out to the garden in the early gray of the morning and walked down to the Brandywine bed. The original bed, the section of ground she had prepared in her first week on the property and had replanted every spring for 46 years. The plants were newly set in the ground, transplanted from the cold frame the week before, thick-stemmed and dark, already reaching for the stakes. She sat down beside the bed and opened the notebook to the last page with writing on it. Then she turned to the final blank page, the absolute last one, and took the pencil from her pocket. She wrote, "Year 46, the Brandywines are in. The spring is running well. The bees are back. Iris has the east section under her control. The boys are managing the pipe system. It is early morning and the cove is very quiet." She stopped, looked at what she had written, then added below it after a space, "Mrs. Hooper, I think you knew what this was going to be before I did. I think you saw it the afternoon you showed me the bean rows and decided to answer a 12-year-old's question as if it mattered. It did matter. Everything that came after is the evidence. She closed the notebook. She placed her hands flat in the soil on either side of the nearest plant, the way she had done that 11th morning in 1937 when she had first felt the ground working. The soil was warm. The roots of the seedling were already beginning their outward movement into the mineral-rich ground, finding the pathways that the water had prepared over 46 years of steady delivery. The spring ran behind her with its note unchanged. Iris found her there 2 hours later, kneeling between the rows with her hands in the earth and the notebook lying open beside her in the morning light. The page it had fallen open to was near the beginning in Mrs. Hooper's handwriting, a passage she had written sometime in the 1920s. The question a good student asks is never really about the plant. It is about the relationship between the plant and everything the plant depends on, which is everything. Iris stood at the edge of the bed for a long time. Then she picked up the notebook carefully, the way you handle something that has earned its fragility, and carried it inside. The spring kept flowing. It flows still. The same crack in the same limestone bluff, the same aquifer fed by the same ancient rain, the same mineral character carried up from the same deep rock. The cooperative now distributes the water through a system of pipes to more than 200 acres in the valley. The Brandywine tomatoes grown from seeds that have been saved every year since 1937 are sold at farmers' markets in Nashville and Knoxville at prices that would have seemed impossible to the girl who first planted one in a tin can with holes punched in the bottom. On the granite stone beside the pool, carved in 3 hands across 4 decades, 3 lines. This water was always good. We were afraid of the color. Flora wasn't. Hooper taught her to look. She taught us to see. She knelt down and planted anyway. $1's worth of land, a dead woman's notebook, a blue spring that everyone for 100 years had been afraid to touch, and one person who looked at all of it and asked the right question. The question was not, is this safe? The question was not, what will people think? The question, the one that unlocked everything, was the same question a 12-year-old girl had asked standing in a bean row on a rainy afternoon in 1933. The question that had made Ida Hooper stop walking and say, "Follow me." The question was simply why. Why is this different from that? Why does the color mean what everyone says it means? Why has no one tested the thing they are afraid of? Why, if the water is wrong, does everything watered by it insist on being so extraordinarily right? There is a blue spring in every life. Not a literal one, though some people are lucky enough to have that too. But the thing that everyone around you has decided is dangerous without examining it, the resource that has been written off by accumulated opinion and inherited fear, the strange colored water that has been flowing patiently beside the path you walk every day, waiting for someone to kneel down and find out what it actually is. Most people walk past it. They were told to. The telling happened so long ago that it no longer feels like advice. It feels like knowledge. It feels like the obvious settled truth about a thing that does not require re-examination. Flora May Gant had $1. She had no other options. She had a dead woman's methodology and the specific quality of attention that methodology required. She knelt down. Everything else followed from that.